John Williams, the 20th century American author, has seen his literary reputation soar over the last 20 years. Today, he's most known for Stoner, which is really on the verge of entering the conversation for great American novel, as controversial as that topic can be. During his lifetime, he won a National Book Award for Augustus, and then he wrote Butcher's Crossing, which is also a great book. Nothing But the Night is the fourth book. It's his debut novel, and what we see here is a young author getting his reps in. I'm Nathan Harold. I like reading books that help us grow, and today I'm just covering the weakest work by a great author. So Nothing But the Night has a very simple plot. It's about a young guy, Arthur Manley, living alone in New York City. And he's struggling to get through each day. We know that a couple years earlier, he had a nervous breakdown, and he has this very strained relationship with his father, who's this global merchant and has pretty deep pockets. So the book's narrative is actually very thin. Arthur spends a little bit of time in New York City wandering around. He meets up with a flamboyant friend, and then he meets up with his dad for dinner and has this very tense conversation, and then he gets drunk and dances. But the central question of Nothing But the Night is, can Arthur connect with others, or is he actually better off being left alone? I'll give you a sense of the heart of this book. Arthur is meeting up with his dad. They don't get along too well. And they're both kind of losing their grip on the world around them, both in different ways. So they're having dinner and both characters are having these conflicting emotions during the scene. So here I'm starting with his father, Hollis, speaking to his son. And his dad, Hollis, says, "God," he said softly, "what a tangled mess we make out of our living." He paused. "I haven't been a very good father, have I, Art? If I had known, you see, I was young, not in years, but in the important ways. There were so many things I didn't stop to think about, to figure out, but those are excuses. It is, and was, my fault, I guess. It started out wrong, and I let it go wrong for so long that, well, we weren't able to straighten it out. If in the beginning I had been a little wiser, or a little kinder, or if I had just known as much about things then as I know now, Lord, I wonder how many people have said that, but if I had, things might have been different, mightn't they?" Arthur did not know how to handle the unaccustomed warmth that flowed inside him. It was so tentative and new. When he spoke, his voice was hardly above a whisper. "I guess we can't really be sure of anything," he said. "Everybody tries to do what they think is right, best, and if it doesn't work out, why, it's hard to put the blame on anyone. Things just happen." So this passage stuck out to me as I was reading because this is something that John Williams wrestles with much more in his later works. This ponderance of evaluating the consequences of our actions in life. And in later books, there's a lot more emotional force and maturity as he explores this. But you can see those inclinations were here early on when he's 24, 25 writing this. Here in this passage, Arthur and Hollis are both very explicit about what they're wrestling with, and it is just so much more deftly handled in later works. As John Williams would dedicate more of his career to writing, he really put a fine point on kind of a really profound question. What does our life add up to? Something else about Nothing But the Night that stuck out to me was reading this, it feels very mid-century American. The style feels a little bit dated. The preoccupations feel a little bit dated. John Williams visits a couple of ideas that were kind of prevalent at the time. For instance, the book opens with the dream sequence. So there's this gauze of surrealism that appears a couple of times throughout the book. And then there's this distortion of time, which was a hot topic in modernist literature. This was actually published in 1948, but surrealism and the plasticity of time were really explored a decade or two earlier. This is the kind of stuff John Williams was probably raised on. Just in this one aspect, it reminded me of William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, that experimentation with reality and time. The other prevalent theme is that there's this heavy blanket of isolation within the novel. And this is really a strong theme in literature published after World War II. And isolation is what Arthur is really trying to work through. There were times reading this where I felt like I was reading kind of a J.D. Salinger knockoff, in that I'm reading about a young man and he's exploring New York City and he's alone and he is also on the verge of a mental breakdown. And that's not a discredit to John Williams. J.D. Salinger is a phenomenal writer and his 9 stories are some of the best stories written by anyone. But this isn't J.D. Salinger, where Salinger has such depth and an undercurrent to his characters that isn't always spoken explicitly. This felt very much like a first novel. Even in that passage I read, everything was very explicit. Everything was very on the surface and open in the characters interacting with each other. It's the kind of book an author could start their career with, but then grow and go on to do much more impressive things. And that's exactly what John Williams ended up doing. But when this came out, he was only 26 years old, and actually he wouldn't publish another novel for another 12 years. But John Williams' story is kind of encouraging. He went to college for a year, he failed, he went to fight in World War II in Asia, and while there he began writing the book. It came out shortly after World War II, but during the war he did collect some lifelong demons, and that would give a lot of depth to his later works. He re-enrolled in college, got a degree, got a couple more degrees, and then we'd go on to become one of this country's best writers. So if you're really interested in John Williams, I would recommend going through after you've read his other works. It's short enough where you could call it a novella, barely over 100 pages. And then there's a nice interview with his wife at the end of the book. First attempts don't always need to be published, and if you're an author who's collected rejections, take some solace in that. At the very least, let's see, this was published 80 years ago. You know, if your debut novel's not published, maybe you're saved from some booktuber bleeping and blooping to other AI avatars in 2100 about how terrible your book is. So, bet they'll have an easier time getting subscribers then, though. If I were talking to John Williams when this book came out, I would say there's a lot going on with this character, and I like how you knew what you wanted to explore with him. I'd say good, clean prose. I'd say one of the greatest compliments I could pay to him is I read it in one evening. I would say, please don't wait 12 years to write your next book. All right, I feel like I've put out a PSA on Nothing But the Night, but if you've heard of John Williams and you've heard he's a great author and you were thinking, let me start at the beginning or let me start with his shortest book, I don't want you to read this and then feel dissuaded from picking up his other later and greater works. And if you're already a John Williams fan, you might actually like this. You might like picking this up and seeing the seeds that he would nurture in his later works, and you might enjoy seeing him grow. Sometimes when we really like an author, we can become more forgiving of their lesser works because we just like spending time with them, and that's how I felt about Nothing But the Night. Thank you for joining me today. If you like John Williams, let me know. If you read Nothing But the Night, tell me if you got more out of it. I will get around to eventually covering Stoner, I know, and Butcher's Crossing. In the meantime, I have a video on Augustus, so I'll try to link that in YouTube, figure that out, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, bye.